Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lodgge Podcast. Welcome back for episode 14. I am so excited to introduce my new, uniquely talented guest, George Geczy. George, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, thanks, and I hope you're doing well too.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. I love doing these. I always get really excited. George has been a central figure in the Ontario industry for over 20 years. As the co-owner, director, and tech lead at BattleGoat Studios, he has released over 8 games in the Supreme Ruler franchise just with that studio, as well as their latest game, Galactic Ruler. Today, we're going to be discussing the studio's vision for the strategy genre, the Ontario video game ecosystem, and much more. So, without further ado, let's get into the conversation. So, George, you've been working in the industry full time at BattleGoat since what, 2000?
2000, yep.
But your love for video games goes back way farther than that. Can you tell me a little bit about what sparked that initial interest and that initial joy in the video game industry?
Well, I mean, it actually started when I was in high school, and somehow I managed to convince my parents to buy me a computer, which was they're pretty pricey back then. I think the total was over $2,000 for the computer, and that was in actual money at that time. And I don't know how I managed to convince my parents to do that. But somehow I told my mom, "Oh yeah, I'll write a video game, and and then it'll sell, and then we'll all be rich, and I'll buy you a new car." And somehow I convinced. I don't think she believed that, but it's still. I got the computer, and I started working on games because I'm actually not sure why video games specifically. I mean, this was obviously. In the early generation of video games, when they were coming on the scene with the Ataris and the Nintendos and so on, everyone was learning what video games were about. But I liked strategy games. I liked the that sort of thing, and I just dove right in, taught myself programming, and started working on it.
So that actually brings us to the first topic is we need to talk about Supreme Ruler. That's going to be obviously a focal point of this because it's been a major focal point of your life, not even just BattleGoat. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to work on the same franchise voluntarily for 40 years, nearly 40 years at this point?
Yeah, from the and so the first game. Well, there were a couple of games that I had actually released. I guess maybe my first sales as a software developer. There was one that was sold to a magazine. This was back in the days when code was in BASIC and you would type it in off a magazine onto your computer and run it. That was my first sale when I was in high school, and then I sold a couple other small projects. But then when I started working on the strategy game, the first Supreme Ruler, I actually thought, this is a really nice game. I think this is I not only did I enjoy making it, I enjoyed playing it, and I thought it was very well done. And then I decided to actually self-publish it. But the reason, the Supreme Ruler, that sort of game was always what caught my interest at the time. And yeah, so starting from high school, I created the first Supreme Ruler. It was a text-based game for the Tiara City microcomputer, the computer that was around just before the IBM PC was released. And the self-publishing was an interesting experience, but the making the game was the fun part.
So from that second game release all the way until BattleGoat's announcement and release and when you guys first got started, we had about what 10, 20 15 years. So what did you do to kind of keep that dream alive? What did you do with Supreme Ruler when you after you released that second game and before you actually launched your own studio? What was something that you were doing? Were you kind of fiddling in the background and always kind of working on it, or was it something that you decided later in life that you're like, you know what, I want to get back to this. This is what I want to do, and this is the series that I want to continue to work on.
Well, one of the things is once we did get into that early self-publishing era with Supreme Ruler and so on, then the microcomputer business started to change pretty rapidly, and that's when the IBM PC started taking over, and very soon after that, the Apple Macintosh was introduced, and so on. And during that time frame, we weren't, the company that my family and I had set up to publish Supreme Ruler, it just wasn't a profitable way forward. And so, life took us in a couple of other directions, and we actually ended up running a computer store, basically selling software, hardware, making PCs, all of that for 15 years.
Wow.
And then around the year 2000, and in fact, my business partner, David Thompson, who's still, the co-owner of BattleGoat Studios with myself, he and I were fiddling around thinking about bringing Supreme Ruler back, to the PC, bringing it to a modern thing. But we were also running a full-time business with the computer store at the same time. And then around 2000, we said, okay, well, enough of this. We sold off our share in the computer store, and started up BattleGoat Studios. And the goal was to bring Supreme Ruler to the modern generation.
The rest is history at this point.
So far.
So one thing I did want to get in before we really dive into BattleGoat is it's been very clear throughout your experience, even just with a quick glance at a resume, of your constant need to want to give back to the community. So before we actually started recording, you were talking about how BattleGoat always has kind of an influx of interns, right? There's always about training people up in the industry, giving back, and making sure that the next generation is going to be able to kind of carry on some of these traditions and to learn some of these skills. So with your work as a organizing committee member at the Science and Engineering Fair in the Bay Area, you spend time as a professor at Mohawk College, and you sit on numerous boards, including Interactive Ontario's. So why are these type of initiatives so important to you? It seems like you're always doing 3 or 4 things at once. So I'm curious of why it's clearly an important part of who you are.
And I think even when we were in the business with the computer store and in that area, we were actually one of the largest computer stores in our area, the Hamilton area. We were the supplier to both school boards, to the city government, and so on. But I felt that being a big company that had that presence meant you really were part of the community. So even at that point, I was on the Chamber of Commerce. I led their Science and Technology Committee. I was on working with the Hamilton Public Library, and ended up on the board of the Public Library, and then also sorts of other types of initiatives, because it just felt that if you're a part of the community, then you have to be part of that community. You have to give back to it. You have to share your talents. You have to encourage others. And when we got into the BattleGoat Studios, the community was a little different. When we had the computer store, we were part of the physical community of Hamilton. We were a store, and we had a presence, and people would drop in and say hi. When we were BattleGoat, it was different. We were almost our community was Canadian developers in Ontario in particular, and so supporting each other, supporting talent, bringing training new talent, supporting other studios as they start up. There's talking to them about how to navigate, things like the Ontario Creates and the CMF and the funding opportunities, how to navigate publishing. And in fact, one of our early things in BattleGoat, we were signed with a publisher that was going to put out our first title for the PC, Supreme Ruler 2010. And a few months before the title was going to be released, the publisher went bankrupt, which was a bit of a bump in our road. And though eventually the title did get out there, it was a very rocky relationship, and we learned a lot of things the first time about that experience, how to deal with publishers, contracts, how to protect yourself. And that's information that I thought it was important to other studios. There's no reason why everybody needs to learn all their lessons through the bumps and the mistakes. It's if we can share that information, and then other people can share with me, the lessons they've learned in other areas that we hadn't encountered yet, then we're all for the better for it. And so again, the whole thing of supporting the community just makes each studio stronger. There's no reason to be in our own silos about this.
I think that is one thing too that kind of makes Ontario unique, especially in Canada, is that we do have obviously the highest number of like micro studios or smaller studios in the country. So you do see a lot more of this type of collaboration, right? And like being able to run the Interactive Ontario Discord, where we have a lot of these types of conversations, the Ontario Creates and the CMFs and all the other funding things going on, people discussing publishing, and like you mentioned, a lot of the other bumps that people have gone through and sharing those experiences has been just an absolute pleasure to be able to watch, because there's so many studios that have been around for 6 months, a year, and then now they're like, okay, we came in wanting to make a video game. Now we have to run a business. right? That tends to be the way we see a lot of people kind of coming into the industry, is that they're thinking their game first rather than as a company. And then they get 6 months to a year in and they realize, oh no, I need to figure out, I need to learn how to do all this. I need to learn how to do payroll. I need to run this, run that. And
Yeah.
then having a space and having a community that they can jump into and say, hey, who has experienced this? And within 10 minutes, there are links being dropped, there are stories being shared. There's a lot of bonding going on between some of those senior studios like yourselves, and a lot of these new people. And it's really fun to be able to watch that and see that they do have resources that they can rely on that are in the community and that have gone through these experiences themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things that occasionally comes up, especially somebody out of the industry will say, how do you deal with your competition, or who's your competition in the industry, and so on. And first of all, other studios are not at all. I mean, I have no problem in telling all the lessons I've learned and the secrets I know to other studios, because they're not competition. I mean, I'll release a video game, they'll release a video game, and hopefully, people will buy both games. Obviously, a lot of people will have different genres of game, and they'll have games on different platforms, phones and PCs and consoles. And so, really, one studio does not compete with another. It happens even in my own genre of strategy games. Occasionally, I'll have be on a forum and have some of our players talking about new games coming out, and they'll talk about, should I buy this one or that one? And I'm saying, you can't buy both. I mean, especially in my genre, there aren't that many games released in a year. I think you can probably, pick mine up in March and the other guys up in June, and you'll be very happy playing lots of hours. So competition doesn't work the same way in this business as you would think in other types of businesses.
I completely agree. And yeah, especially you made that comment about genres, that it's, you're not spending 10 hours and you're not competing with your other like linear FPSs and all of these like incredibly AAA studios. It's the intelligent strategy genre, as you guys have dubbed it,
Yeah.
which actually leads us right into the conversation of BattleGoat Studios. So founded in 2000. I always want to say 2020. It's founded in 2000.
Yeah.
You've nearly exclusively worked on strategy titles, specifically intelligent strategy games. So what is it about your titles that make them stand apart from your regular run-of-the-mill strategy titles?
I mean, it is something that, and when we set out the path, maybe we didn't necessarily intend originally to create games of exactly the way we ended up doing, but we are obviously have certain genres that our developers, myself, my business partner David, and other people we bring on board, we are fans of the strategy genre, which means things like Civilization, things like the Age of Empires types of games, Command and Conquer. There's one of my favorite games is from a little bit earlier called Panzer General, which was a little war game, and even 20 years later, I still love to occasionally play it just because it has that sort of mechanic that I love. So we brought our love for all these types of strategy games on board, and we wanted to create a strategy game that really offered players a lot of depth. So sometimes people call our games like Civilization on steroids, where we take a much more deep look at that sort of gameplay. It is a bit of a dangerous path to walk down, because it makes our games harder for new players to jump into, and are less accessible because of that. And it is a problem that we work on. We sometimes look at, especially as we come out with new iterations in our series, do we simplify the mechanic, but then our existing players and players who do like a deep strategy game do want more than that. So we do have that balancing act going on, and we maybe more than we should, we've leaned on a more in-depth game that has more detail, more complexity to it. But again, there are players that certainly enjoy that. There are some players that have been with us for 20 years, since our first release of I think our 2010, our first PC game went into beta about 2003, so about 20 years ago. And there have been players who've been with us that whole time, and we've developed quite an audience around that sort of game. And I think there's definitely a place in the market for it. We're not going to make a million copies of a game like this, but we have a strong audience, and I think there's certainly an interest in having games that are a little more complex than your your Plants versus Zombies, I guess you would
I
say.
think you just answered like my next two questions, which is fantastic. I was curious about kind of how you make things a little bit more accessible to some new players, and how do you not lose your core. So I think you just answered that right off the bat. Is to kind of double down on that niche, right? Double down on that audience that really loves to be able to really get down to the micro. Um, and one thing I do want to bring up with that is like the crafting systems and the mechanics in your games are so meticulous, right? They're so down to the last detail. So what lessons have you learned, and how do you balance the realism of the worlds that you're building and the fun of still playing a video game?
And I think we do experiment with a lot of different things, and so I think we also do look at what other games in the strategy market are doing, and then certainly some titles go a route of trying to simplify things. We've also noticed that a lot of titles that are maybe longer term. Um, Franchises, when they do come out with a version that tries to simplify the mechanics, they do lose a lot of their existing audience, and so there's a lot of grumbling about the fact that don't just dumb it down. We do look at other ways to try to bring things on board. With Galactic Ruler, which we can talk about in a moment, we did some
100%.
things that we hadn't done before. But with the Supreme Ruler Caesar itself, we are adding in more automation mechanics. The idea was, if you don't care, let's say, about the economy, you have ministers and you just set them to run the economy. And if you don't care about other areas such as production and research and so on, again, you can automate those sub pieces and let the ministers, which is AI ministers, handle it. And that's worked to a large extent to help people get into it a little easier. But one thing, it's sort of a a lesson in psychology of players, that once you give them a button, even if they tell them you don't have to turn on this button, they're of course all going to press the button, and they turn on every option, and then they make the game really complicated, and they say this game is too complicated. But we say you didn't have to press all of those buttons. They didn't have to go into every sub menu. So again, we are balancing that out and trying to give the player. And in fact, we find if we can give the players more feedback about what's going on, and that's in with our 20. There's a lot of effort being put into doing that, giving the player more idea of why something happened, why it didn't happen, and what's underneath it. And we found that's one of our biggest challenges too. AI is often a point about strategy games that is often criticized, and I've learned over the years that no matter what happens, players won't understand it. They'll sometimes, for example, if the game is too aggressive and beats them right away, then they'll get upset. If the game is too easy, it's, oh well, the AI is too easy. And then we give them a difficulty setting, and half the players won't set the difficulty setting to the difficulty they should. And so then maybe we'll automate the difficulty setting to have it automatically adjust, because the player isn't going to do that. And so these micro changes are ways that we try to address more the psychology of the game as opposed to the actual mechanics of it.
That sounds like a very tricky battle of trying to continually, like, there's such a thin line between respecting the player and kind of leaving them out in the cold, right? Where it's like
Yes.
you want them to be able to figure out stuff themselves, but you also want to be able to kind of hold their hand when clearly there's either something missing, or there's something that they're not getting, or there's just a mechanic that they haven't used correctly. So that must be such an interesting balance that you've learned over these last 8 games. So one thing I do want to bring up too is a lot of times when a new game comes out, right, 2, 3, like a sequel or whatever it may be, is everyone always asked, well, do I have to play the first one? Oh, do I have to play the first two? Can you tell us a little bit about that with Supreme Ruler? That it always being a Supreme Ruler franchise, and then a different year, a different focus, a different point in history. Can you tell us a little bit about? Do you need to be playing those earlier games? Are there any that actually connect? And what would you be missing if you came in jumping in at your latest game that's coming out later this year?
Actually, they do stand pretty much alone. I mean, our first one, 2010, was when we, it was published in 2005. So it was our view of the future of the world, 5 years down the road. Of course, that future is now 13 years ago. But
Lo and behold. Yep.
um, that was it accomplished a lot, but it also had some limitations in its technical design. And in fact, the next game that we released, which was Supreme Ruler 2020, pushing the future a little further down the line, was where we actually got a lot of our technologies that some of which we still use today into the game. Well, like one of the big ones that Supreme Alert 2020 added was the ability that you play on the entire world at once. Our first game actually had the world divided into sub pieces and campaigns that you would progress up with. So, for example, you would play the Australia campaign where you'd be a shattered Australia, Australian Civil War or whatever, and one side, New South Wales would be attacking Queensland, and you'd try to look for dominating all of Australia. And if you did that, then you'd be given another part of the world, like maybe Africa or Europe, and we weren't able to simulate the entire world at once because there are some technical issues with that, but we were both because of the progression of computer power and also because of our own tech, which and maybe a shout out to our Canadian government on that one. The SHRED program, the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Program, is a funding program we've been able to use to develop some of that tech. I mean, the program is aimed at basically it's any type of research, but in our industry would be software research for things that you just aren't out there yet. In our case, our world map has, we simulate the entire world down to, we use hexes for the war gamers out there. So we simulate the world down to 1 million, actually 2 million individual hexes. So, there's a, hex for Hamilton, and it has the information of, the population and the resources and so on. And there's a hex for, the Burlington next to it and so on. And then the entire world is simulated down to that level of detail. So that's my tangent onto technology. But with our Supreme Alert 2020 game, we were able to get that technology working into the game. And so you could simulate the entire world at one time. So there could be you and in multiplayer, let's say you and a friend having a battle in Europe, and then 2 other people having a battle in Southeast Asia. And those are all simulated across the world and resolving at the same time. And so that was really when we got our sort of our game engine rolling. And after that, we created basically evolutions of that. So we had a Cold War version, which was published, both 2020 and the Cold War version were published by our good friends at Paradox Interactive, who have since then become a much larger company than they were back then. But
I was looking through and I was like, Paradox. I was like, damn.
Yeah. No, we were with Paradox in the early days, and they were really a big help to us in both getting those projects out, and we have a really good relationship with them. And so then we did the Cold War game. And after that, we were wanted to do a World War II game. And in fact, that's when, with Paradox, they sort of said, well, we already have our World War II franchise. We don't, that could get a little confusing. Plus, we were looking at our numbers, and the publishing through Paradox, while it was good, have to know that publisher takes a very large cut. Most publishers agreements like that have a 50-50 cut. And then when you look at the fact that the market was changing to a digital market, most of our game sales were going through Steam. Steam took a 30% cut. Then there's a 50-50 of what's left. But we had put 2 and 2 together and knew that we could go directly to Steam as well. And in fact, with 1936, that was our first title where we self-published and took it right to Steam on our own.
Is it something that's intentional of do you jump back and forth when it comes to just timelines? Like, are you do you like doing future and then doing history? Because clearly you and your team are diehard history buffs. I've been in enough calls and enough meetings with you and stuff that I've heard some of the things that have come out of your mouth and been like, this is something that you clearly love deeply. Is it something that you intentionally do as a team to kind of keep that like passion and innovation fresh rather than just like small increments of 5 years in history of kind of redoing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, there was always, for me personally, and again, with that history interest that I had personally, World War II was definitely one I wanted to take our engine to, because I knew we could do it on a scale that was different than other games. And a lot of computer games that do cover World War II will cover them on a single front. There's the Eastern Front or the European battles or the Pacific battles. We were able to, with our engine, cover the entire world, and it is a world war after all. And then we did also have both player interest and interest from Chris Latour, who's our project manager here, of doing a World War I game. So we had the Supreme Alert, the Great War, and so we did step back there. And then we basically took all of these things, all of these different eras we had and put them together into our game Supreme Rule Ultimate, which was just the combination of all the eras, so you could play the game and start at any of these levels. So it had the World War One, with the DLC, World War Two. It had the Cold War, and it had the modern day. The reason, as now we are developing Supreme Lord 2030, is we do have a very strong audience and still a following for the modern day games. It is maybe a piece that's not necessarily as big in the war game and simulation, computer simulation, as World War II is, and it really does bring a lot of interest to it. I think one of the things when we created Supreme Lord 2020, I guess that was first released in 2008. So we were looking 12 years into the future. We tried to predict a world that was messy, civil wars and nationalism and populism and blah 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 and all sorts of horrible things. Unfortunately, the world actually caught up to us and was equally horrible to what we had predicted. And
say,
maybe even,
yeah.
I mean, we didn't even predict a plague, and that came, but there were. There were definitely things that when trying to create a chaotic world, the reality sometimes catches up to us. But I think our game engine is, again, in a unique position where you can actually both simulate real things that are happening. And that's one of the things about our upcoming game 2030. It's actually going to ship with two sandboxes. One is in the near future, where we're going to use a little bit of our storytelling to create some storylines of interest, but the other is also a modern world, 2023. So you could actually just jump into the world the way it is right now and see the relationships between the countries the way they are today. Some people like that modern view, and some people like the near future view. And so we are definitely trying to really bring a lot of our creativity to that audience.
That's honestly wild to even think about. I did make a note of that, but like I really want to actually kind of focus on that for a moment. Is a lot of strategy games, especially like what I'm picturing. Again, I'm picturing Age of Empires. So I'm thinking like the Romans, and I'm thinking like during Egyptian times and like all of that stuff. And then of course you think of your futures. You think of like your galactic rulers and like those type of games. But having something where it's in Ottawa, like where I'm from, 2020, like 2023, this is the state of the world. How do I want to move forward with it? To me, like maybe I'm just not as ingrained in the strategy game ecosystem as I should be, but it sounds like something that's so unique that it's, and there's also a lot of commentary, right? Like you're kind of able to put in a lot of things that you guys have like been looking at and researched, and there's also a lot of very charged topics because there's a lot
Yes.
of things that you're talking about things that happened 100 years ago is very very different rather than the things that you're talking about today. Is that ever something that you guys have worried about or been had any issues with, that you're like you want to be careful about certain things that you're talking about now to avoid them like offending the masses?
Well, one of the jokes we've made for quite a number of years is, well, early on, for example, I think it was the game Hearts of Iron by Paradox got banned in China because of their approach to something.
Hmm.
And and we were talking about the fact, boy, if we could get banned in China, that'll be great press. I mean, we really should do that. But sadly, we haven't been officially banned in China, but I don't think you can buy our game on China anyway. Issues, those come up as debates very often amongst our community. So, to some extent, we try not to necessarily take a stand, but we
Oh, of
reflect the
course.
world as it is. So we reflect actual uh, tensions in the world, and sometimes people don't like the fact that the map is drawn the way it's drawn. Actually, one of the DLCs that we released for free for Supreme Ruler Ultimate was called Trump Rising. It was released in 2016. It was released before the election, and it was actually meant a bit as a joke. It was meant, if Donald Trump, ever became president, this is what the world would look like. Ha ha ha! A little bit of joke. It's never going to happen. We'll take the DLC down when the auction's over. And of course, history proved us to be slightly wrong about our prediction of it not happening. And so it was an interesting, not just an interesting piece of simulation, but it of course caused quite a bit of debate on our forums, as the political left and right of the U.S. descended on us and had arguments about whether we were either mocking the issue or else or downplaying it, or whatever you wanted to do.
Well, with things like that, obviously that's going to be a little bit tense. But I think also some of it, maybe not that particular DLC, but also encourages discussion and encourages people to educate themselves on certain world issues. So I think that is interesting that you've kind of been able to to build that conversation, even if it's debate. Obviously, as long as people keep it respectful and understanding. But I think having those conversations is a good thing. So I'm sure there are some people that have been on those forums that have, made a little bit of an effort to, maybe do a little bit more research or be interested in some of these topics, maybe more than they would have been otherwise. So I think that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I mean,
but ta-
probably
oh,
one. I was just to say one
no,
other
please.
area where we did get some controversy was last year. We also had a 2-week Ukrainian charity event. So pretty soon after the war in Ukraine started, we wanted to do something to support some of the Ukrainian non-governmental agencies, Red Cross and so on. So we did.
Oh
We
yeah.
donated. We had the game on sale for 2 weeks, and we donated the proceeds all from the game for to Ukrainian charities, and we did some live streams and stuff. And that itself, of course, caused issues in our Discord about people who thought we were politicizing whatever. But it's just the way the world is. We are simulating the world, and this is what's happening.
And some people also forget that there are humans behind the games that they make, that they
Yeah.
love so much. So this is the way of the world. So taking it from the near future of 2030 all the way to your most recently released game, Galactic Ruler, I would love to talk a little bit about why sci-fi. Like clearly, you've always been a little bit into the future, and we've already mentioned, the Great War and like some of these past ones. What was it that was like, you know what? Instead of this world is now getting boring to us, let's go to the stars. What was that inspiration like?
Well, it's sort of funny. One of the things about Galactic Ruler is when we did Supreme Ruler in 2005, we actually even before it was released, we we got the domain name galacticruler.com, and we had registered it, and then some people noticed that, and in fact we put up a little page that just had a little background picture of some solar system and whatever, and just said Galactic Ruler, and had nothing else on it. And so that was back 20 years ago. And then a couple of things happened. First of all, we are a one project at a time studio generally, and so we were working on the Supreme Ruler titles in the engine. Secondly, we also noticed that a lot of people had done galactic type games pretty well, that had taken a lot of what we were maybe looking to accomplish. And I think Stardoc's Galactic Civilizations is one of them that really did a good job with that. And then, things got busy. We always looked at Galactic Ruler as a possible title. It actually goes back to probably some program design that I had written out again, even back in the days of when I was in high school, talking about a galaxy type of game based on those old Star Trek games that used to be popular on PCs way back in the day. But that kept getting put back in the file. But when we we're taking a look at what to do after, the Supreme Ruler Ultimate, the Galactic Ruler, we had the technical capability to do some stuff that nobody else was doing. For example, games like Stellaris by Paradox or Galactic Civilizations, they focus on the big picture of the galaxy strategy, but planets are something you can set. For example, this planet I'm going to mine some resource on, this one I'll have some population on, but you never really got down to the planetary level of interacting. With Galactic Ruler, what we were able to do is take our engine, and each planet itself is simulated independently. So you can go down to the planet level, you can move around your tanks or units or whatever, and you can actually have battles on the planet, and then battles in space, and then battles on a different planet in a different solar system. So again, taking that big simulation capability that our game engine has, you can actually be having 10 different battles on 10 different planets in the game, which can be overwhelming, but does give players the scope of game that wasn't available through anything else that anyone else was doing. And we really had a lot of cool ideas on that. We did also test out a lot of ideas at simplifying some of our game mechanic to make it more accessible. The whole thing was a bit of a lesson in what does and doesn't work. And I think definitely one of the lessons we learned is that the space strategy genre is different from let's say the war game or geopolitical strategy genre that we were in, and a lot of our players didn't cross over. So we learned a lot of lessons both in marketing the game, about trying to get a new community, about what players would come with us to a new game and what wouldn't. So it was a lesson in a lot of things when we released that last year.
That's really interesting to me. So there's obviously a lot that you took from that. That the last thing I want to talk about with BattleGoat is your upcoming title. We've already mentioned it a few times. So what are some of the lessons that you took from Galactic Ruler and you've now put into this title, and what makes this the best Supreme Ruler game yet?
Well, one of the things during the development of Galactic Ruler, we actually had to take our internal engine quite a bit further. So, for example, it's now a 64-bit platform, which gives it more capabilities on the computer, available to access more memory, more performance. We upped its graphics capabilities to DX11. One of the problems that we have is since we do use our own game engine, we don't use Unreal or Unity. And one of the reasons is back in 2000, when we started development, there wasn't an Unreal or a Unity to use, so we had to develop our own engine. But the other reason is because something like Unity can't handle these scopes that I've been talking about. They can't handle, an unlimited number of units, or unlimited, well, not unlimited, but certainly no predetermined limit to the number of units that a player might use, or the size of his army, or the size of the map, and so on. So our engine is designed around that, but it also means we did have some limitations. And with Galactic Ruler, we were able to again take our technology further, and now we can bring that into Supreme Ruler. I mean, it's just one sort of small example. The Supreme Ruler before with the 2020, we had the limit that there were only 200 regions supported in the world, which sounds like it's okay. I mean, there's 200 countries, 200 regions, makes sense. But then when you think, let's say maybe, Quebec splits off from Canada, and Texas secedes from the US, and your Germany splits into 2 or 3 or 4, suddenly you have all these other civil wars going on, and the 200 regions couldn't simulate that. So we actually did have some technical limitations. Those are gone now. We can actually ship what's called a shattered world sandbox, where every state is a separate region, and every province is a separate region, and you can all maybe fight
Cool.
to unify Canada first, and then when you've unified Canada, then start taking over other countries. So that's a capability that we is in the game now that wasn't in there before. And even it also lets us simulate sub-regions, meaning that, for example, let's say you're playing as France, and you see Canada over there, and you're saying, I don't like Canada anymore. Maybe I'm going to convince Quebec to separate. So you can, fund the insurgency and then make Quebec split off from Canada,
Wow.
and things like that. So those capabilities are now in 2030, adding that depth to the diplomatic model. We've always had a lot of depth in our tactical engine, what I call the war game engine. The ability to build tanks and move artillery and take over the world on a tactical level. But the game now has these extra pieces or extra layers on the diplomacy, on the geopolitical side, that I think makes it really beyond other strategic games that are out there.
Wow, I think that's all the promo that you need. So yeah, we'll drop that in the link. Obviously, we'll make sure everyone go wish list Supreme Ruler
Yes.
2030. Can you give us a little bit of the timeline when we can expect this brand new intelligence strategy game to be dropping?
Well, it's set for Q2 of this year, so sometime in that, let's see, what is Q2? April, May, June, I guess. But we have been
Coming up.
pretty flexible. Yeah, May, June is our sort of target, but again, we're actually trying to be. We're not pushing ourselves into a specific release date for two reasons. Number one is going back maybe to the business of games. We don't necessarily believe in that crunch style, and I think most small studios don't anymore.
Agreed.
So there's no reason to hit the date of we are going to absolutely ship this on April 5th, and we're going to do everything we can to do it. And if we don't, we'll ship a buggy version. Tough luck for the users. That doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to a lot of studios. It doesn't make sense to the industry. And so, we're happy to push that date a little bit if it means both getting more visibility out there, getting more features, more testing. The game has actually just launched into its public beta test, so we're getting more some feedback from our long-term users. I shouldn't say necessarily public, but it meaning outside of our studio anyway.
Yeah, of course.
Hitting some of our long-term fans, getting their feedback. So that's another thing we sort of learned with the Galactic Ruler as well. It went through what's called Steam Early Access. For people who are familiar with that, you release an earlier version or a beta version, and you get feedback from the community to complete the game. That for us, that didn't work well, and I think early access for most studios doesn't work like it used to a few years ago. And So for us now, just delaying the release until we're really happy that we have the best possible product is more important than necessarily getting it out there and getting those uh, those early sales. The Not every studio has the ability to do that, but thankfully, because of our position and because of the other supports we have from in Ontario, we've been able to do that.
It actually leads us into the last question that I always have to ask everybody. This being the Lodge, which for those who aren't aware, that the Lodge is run by Interactive Ontario. What is it about the Ontario video game industry that you believe makes us special? That you believe makes us stand apart and something that you continue to enjoy being a part of?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of things about the Ontario industry that, first of all, other support we've had from the smaller studios in Ontario has been huge. It really is a great community. I mean, I've been had the privilege of giving some panel talks and this and that about things like game, financing and government support and this and that, just to share that sort of information. And other studios have shared a lot of information and tips back. And the IO Discord is now a terrific place for people to stay, because the amount of knowledge and the amount of experience on that with the people who are regularly commenting and attending is just huge. You have an issue with insurance, there's somebody who has that answer. You have an issue with financial statements, you have an issue with HR. There are people who have their actual shared insights and experience and are willing to talk about it, and it just makes it so much, not just easier to run a studio, but it also makes it less lonely, I guess. I mean, to be out there and doing some of this stuff without seeing other, there isn't another software studio down the street. This isn't like you just can hop down and pop into a storefront and ask a question. So having that, and especially you have to remember, BattleGoat is also located outside of Toronto, which is something I'm actually happy about. But no diss to Toronto there, but I hate driving to downtown Toronto. So that means we are not physically close to a lot of other studios. So IO gives us that sort of solidarity with the industry. And it also, in Ontario, the other thing that's big too is Ontario Creates, the OMDC, that in the early days, the types of programs that they had, saved us. When our publisher went bankrupt in 2005, it was both the IDMF program and the tax credits gave us the ability to keep our studio going, which would not have happened if those were not there. We would not be we would not be having this conversation if it wasn't for Ontario Creates and the programs that they have in place to support the industry.
I think that's a fantastic way to end the episode. There's a lot going on in Ontario, and again, it's something that we're very clearly very proud of to be a part of. And thank you to Ontario Creates for this podcast as well, with their continuous support for everything that Interactive Ontario does. So I think that'll about do it for episode 14 of the Lodge Podcast. Any final words, George, before we sign off for the day?
Oh, 14. I'm lucky. I'm glad I missed 13, because that would have been bad luck for our lunch. So that's okay. No, I mean, I appreciate the chance to talk about the industry. I know there's a lot more we could have talked about too, but it's really, I see some great things coming for some of the other studios. I see doing amazing work here in Ontario, and I'm really proud to be part of the industry right now.
We appreciate you taking the time to come and join us. I hope that we can jump on a live stream when Supreme Ruler 2030 comes out, and you can give me the breakdown on what makes Supreme Ruler the standalone in the genre. So again, thank you to all of our listeners for coming through. Natalie, thank you as our producer on the ones and twos as always. Again, thank you to Ontario Creates for supporting the podcast. For those who are going to GDC 2023, make sure to come on by the Ontario Creates booth. Interactive Ontario will be there, including myself. So please come say hi. And until then, take care.